Yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Beyond the Needs analysis and why listening is the first sale. We're really happy to have you here today, and I'm going to be your host. I'm Craig Isaac, Senior Vice President with 34 Strong, and with me today I have Keith Richardson from LQ Listening Intelligence. Before we get into the actual introductions, let me tell you a story because I think it relates directly to what we're going to talk about today. Couple weeks ago, my bucolic little town had Art Fest, and they have Art Fest every September. And my wife and I love to go. And we went for the first 4 years. This was year 5. And each year, we have purchased something, if not multiple things from local artists that display their art. But interestingly, this year, we knew we were going to go. Um, but we decided before we ever got there, we're not buying anything this year for a number of different reasons, not least of which is kids in college. And so we weren't going to buy anything. And even the years where we did buy something, we always toured the entirety of the event before we went back and looked at pieces that were interesting to us. And what happened this year was that we made a purchase 5 minutes into our tour of the event, and it was clearly an emotional purchase. And yet, we had zero regret. The only question really was where we were going to hang it, and we had a good conversation with the artist about what kind of background it needed. You know, was the paint going to be dark or light, or what kind of surroundings near a window or in a hallway? And so we've since found a home for it, and we love it. It's amazing. But it was an emotional purchase, and we had zero regret. And so, we're going to talk about the emotional side of buying and how that applies to the B2B business sale. So before we go any further, let me just introduce myself. I have 20 years of corporate sales experience, including working in training. My strengths are learner and input from a Clifton Strengths perspective. And when I apply that to the sales environment, it means that I'm always looking for something else that's going to give me an edge. Currently, I serve as Senior Vice President of Business Development at a small global consulting firm called 34 Strong. And we have worked with some of the biggest companies in the country. We've had contracts at the federal government level, many at the state government level, and the local government, cities and counties as well. So we work with many different size organizations. And so my ability to connect with buyers is critical. So I'm always looking for something more. And I thought, some of the things that I've been thinking about, some of the things I've learned, and some of the things I'm coming to learn would be great to share with others. And so I've invited my friend Keith here to be our guest expert on this webinar today. So let me introduce Keith. He's the Director of Client and Engagement or Partner Engagement at LQ Listening Intelligence. He's got over 20 years of experience in B2B sales across all markets from small business through enterprise. He's had many different roles from AE to various specialist roles in partner management and leadership roles. In fact, and when I'm done this intro, I think you've got one other thing around what you're doing with sales training that I think everyone needs to know from your lips. And over the past 6 years, he's worked with executives to develop effective leadership strategies and helped create structure for cultural development. Recently, he is working with the Echo Listening Profile and has helped many individual contributors and leaders understand how listening drives performance. Keith, did I leave anything out?
No, not yet. So thank you. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, so let's get into the heart of the discussion then. You've probably heard the saying, well, because I mentioned it a few minutes ago, people buy on emotion and justify it with logic. That's certainly the case of what happened with my wife and I at Art Fest. Typically, people think this applies to, personal purchases, that B2C environment, the things we buy that are new and shiny, like cars or grills, TVs or treadmills, some of those fitness pieces of equipment that are collecting dust in some of our houses. But I think, Keith, you would also say that it applies in B2B sales as well. So I'd love for you to share with us how you see it applying in B2B sales.
I love this question and topic so much. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Craig. And I will add to my background for the purposes of answering this question, not to, skirt your question earlier. But over the last few years, I've also been doing some consulting with an organization that focuses on the neuroscience of buying, and we specifically do sales consulting. And so what we know in that work, so one of their founders, she's a PhD in neuroscience and does a lot of research around buying patterns and behaviors. What we know, even in the B2B environment, there are three primary emotional triggers for why someone would be evaluating a solution for purchase. And that's fear, risk, and control. We're not going to get into a significant amount of detail on what those are, but the reason it's important to mention is specifically this thing called the limbic system in our bodies, in our brains. The limbic system is primarily responsible for regulation of emotion. And what we know is that the limbic system processes about 9 million pieces of information per second. To Craig's point, to what you said, we make decisions emotionally and we rationalize logically. Our logical prefrontal cortex, where most of our executive functioning happens, processes about 40 pieces of information per second. So I just mentioned that because it's really important to know that like the human buying B2C and the human buying B2B is the same person. It's just different
Mm.
information details and analysis that needs to go into making those decisions. But at the end of the day, there's an underlying emotional motivation. And what we know is those three emotional motivators are fear, risk, and control as the primary elements of making emotional decision making.
That's great, Keith. Love to hear more about fear, risk, and control. It was some time in my career before I had ever even heard of that, and sometime even after that before I even started applying it. This discussion is about that as an emotional trigger for buying. It is also about listening, not active listening 2.0, not just showing up and being present, rather the listening habits that we have, how we're filtering information. So, can you tell us more about listening habits and how they play an important part in the sales process?
Yeah, I think it's obviously this is what I do now at LQ. Uh, it's really important question because while we talk about the underlying motivators of why someone might be looking for a solution, so your customer, which is rooted in the emotional uh, evaluation structure. Something is triggering that. If we have a flat affect and don't care, we're less likely to move forward. Um, but the way we evaluate those decisions is based on the way that we process information, right? So at Echo, we do an assessment that assesses how you default process information based on habits formed over time. It's a cognitive function, right? And we listen through four primary habits. We have the connective habit, the reflective habit, the analytical habit, and the conceptual habit. And so, what's important to understand is that these are the types of information that we seek to satisfy first. And it's all based on the habits that we've built over time. So, this is how, when you're in front of a customer and they have made a decision that they need to solve a problem, they now need to evaluate the solutions that are presented to them in a way that helps them understand how it will solve their problem. And so they're going to evaluate that information through their habits that they've formed over time, right? And ultimately, they're looking to satisfy their dominant habit first. So someone might have the underlying motivator associated with fear, risk, or control, whatever that might be. But then when the solutions start to present, they're going to start looking to solve that problem through the lens of connective, reflective, analytical, or conceptual. Now, just at a high level, I'm going to go real quick on this, Craig. The connective is going to look at it through the lens of the impact on the environment. What is the impact of this solution on the people around me? That's going to be the first lens that they're really trying to evaluate this solution for. The reflective listener is going to be the individual who's going to be evaluating this based on have they done something like this before? Have they tried a similar solution? And what am I going to need to do in order to make this work? So, really understanding their role and past experience associated. The analytical is the one that I think in the sales process we often like to talk to, right? It's the data driven sale. They are looking at it strictly from the lens of validity, action, like how are things going to work? And is what you're telling me true? And then the person with the conceptual listening habit, hi, me and Craig, um, are looking at it from the possibility lens. What can we do with this? What will this do for us? Big picture, long term, new ideas, right? So, just to give a very, very crass and quick overview of those different lenses and how people are going to receive the information as it's presented to them.
Mhm. So I would love our audience to start to think about the fact that they have a listening habit or two. They have a preferred habit, and start to think about which one it might be. So we would love for you to type in the chat what you think it is, and we're going to give you some prompts to do that. So we don't generally recommend that people self-assess. We do have an assessment that we're happy to share, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's go ahead and start to think about it. So audience, as you think about how you listen, and when you're really trying to lock in on a conversation, there's the four habits that Keith brought out. So, do you need context and orientation toward the big picture? If you think that's you, type conceptual. Or do you need to know how accurate and factual the information is? Then type analytical. Do you need to know what you are going to do with the information and whether something has been done before? Type reflective. Or do you need to know how this information is going to affect others? And that if that's your habit, type connective. So that's great. Really happy that folks shared some of their, what they perceive to be their listening habits. And again, we would love to be able to share the assessment with you at some point as well. So don't be shy about asking for that. But let's start to marry up these two concepts: the emotional buying motivator and the listening habit, because we need to pay attention to both, right? Keith, you once told me a story about a company that was looking for a vendor that would solve a retention or attrition issue they were experiencing. So, how did the emotional motivators and then the evaluation lens work together there?
Yeah, it's actually in my other life, my longest standing client. In the case that they were at the time looking to reduce the risk of losing their employees due to the cultural dynamics that were at play at the time inside the organization. And of course, they analyzed the employee engagement surveys. So, what they did is they decided to start evaluating training and development programs based on this risk analysis. There is risk in their environment that people are going to leave, right? And that's the primary lens of risk that they're evaluating in that case, right? And so while I've been doing this for a while, right? Like, sure, the risk of people leaving was the reason we're having this conversation from a business standpoint. But when we're thinking about understanding the underlying fear, risk, or control emotional motivator, we have to dig a little bit deeper. And what we came to realize is that it wasn't just people leaving that was the issue, it was the risk of the impact on their brand if it were the culture that were causing more people to leave at once. What is that long term risk associated with being able to recruit high level employees again? Right. And so the risk wasn't just people leaving, it was the fear, there was that risk of people leaving and negatively impacting the brand, and the brand was the important piece here, right? So then that leads us to the question of, so how are they going to look at solutions? One might tell you that it's easy for us to go, okay, here's what we're going to do. This is our program. It's going to reduce your risk of attrition by 10% over the course of this long, et cetera, right? but it was clear based on a lot of the conversations is that they were actually evaluating the program that they were going to choose based on the impact it had on the team. So were people responding to the program in a meaningful and material way versus do you have the data that proves your thing is going to stop this from happening? Right? They needed to know, will people resonate with the program and will they find it valuable or a waste of time? If people found it to be a waste of time, we wouldn't win. So we decided to do a pilot, and that was going to be our strategy for helping people, helping them gather that feedback to see how the audience responded, right? Now, it is absolutely true there needs to be some proof of return on their investment, right? But that was lowest in their evaluation success. It's easy for me to think that was highest without thinking about how they were actually evaluating the solution. And so we did incorporate data, but it wasn't the primary element of what we were actually selling in the process. And what's interesting about it after now we've worked with them for 4 straight years and will continue to do so, that attrition number is actually not an evaluation criteria at all. They have now looked at it from a healthy attrition. Are people leaving, but still maintaining the brand versus people leaving disgruntled and destroying the brand? So that's the parsing of figuring out what's the emotional buying reason, and then how are they actually going to evaluate it in order to win the business? And we did, and they're a wonderful client and continue to work with them to this day.
Yeah, I love that. I love that the basic needs analysis was not enough. The research, yeah, wasn't the sole answer, but you were coming at it with many other fine factors that got you to where you wanted to be. So I'd love to keep it really practical still in talking about listening habits and how they play out in sales. Can you give me an example? Just now we're focused in on the listening habits. Give me an example of how someone that talks about data driven decisions may or may not actually be looking for data based on their listening habit.
Yeah. This is such a, because this is so common, right? We have to make data driven decisions for the purposes of justifying it as a business. The difference here in personal life versus professional is you don't necessarily have a whole layer of approvals in the process, right? Who all have different evaluation criteria. But we're talking about the person we're interacting with, the one that's going to be our primary influencer, if not decision maker. And so the prior example is a good example of these interplays, but let's do it a little bit different. Let's say your buyer is Craig or I with a high conceptual habit, and you're selling them a technology solution. Now, it is going to be critical to the justification of that purchase that that solution has a high ROI, maybe a high TCO, maybe it has some time saving efficiency that over the course of all of these deployments, you've been able to create this metric that says this is how much we're going to save you. However, you're talking to Craig and I, and we predominantly look at a lens through the conceptual nature of this information. So if you lead us to data, and that's where you start, right? You may lose us in the very first few minutes of the conversation. Why might that be? Well, I need, and Craig, we've talked about this a lot, right? Like, I need the
Yeah.
context first. Tell me where we're going. Tell me the vision. Give me a story. Tell me what this is going to help me solve. And I may be in a market for a solution because I need better control over my data, as an example, but I also need to understand the broader picture before you share with me all of the details associated with how I'm going to get better control of my data, right? And so here's the thing though, we all listen through these 4 habits. Like, these 4 habits are all about the amount of energy it takes to process that type of information, right? So I need the context. Craig needs the context. And then we can have the detailed conversation. But if you give me the details first or give Craig the details first, we end up spending more energy trying to figure out the context ourselves. And in doing that, one, we're not paying attention to exactly what you're saying. And two,
Mhm.
we're going to anchor on this idea that, this probably isn't the best solution. Not because it's not the best solution, but because you didn't help me make it easy to figure out what the context was before you gave me
Mhm.
all the details. And you made me
Yep.
burn more cognitive calories than I needed to in that moment. So,
Yep. Yep. Yeah, so, like, I think probably the audience wants to know, okay, how do we solve for that? I'm gonna not go there yet and just ask you to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of that symbiosis, that energy you're talking about, where people might be mismatched and how that shows up and what results because of that in a sales discussion.
yeah, I think this plays very like it transitions well in the sense that like let's talk about the symbiosis. Like it is about energy. So when Craig and I talk, just at an anecdotal perspective, we can talk big picture. We can talk about if I'm selling to Craig and we have this great first half hour, 45-minute meeting, all things are wonderful. We go to the next meeting and we continue down that road. It might feel like we're in a really good position, but in reality, we just talk the same language. I have given Craig nothing more in his evaluation journey that he needs in order to actually make this decision. So we have to be careful as to understand when we're all talking to someone who speaks our language so that we navigate through the other decision making criteria. You've just made yourself you put yourself in a good position. But on the flip side, right? Going back to that prior example, I'm highly conceptual. So what happens when I'm listening from a conceptual lens? I actually communicate from a conceptual lens. So if I'm speaking to someone who is highly analytical in their habit, and I come to them and I start giving them context, I lead with an analogy and I get started. I will lose them very, very quickly and then we might have some weird it's not working and all of a sudden they're saying nope, they're not the right fit for us, not because again you don't have the best solution but because you weren't speaking the language they needed to satisfy in order to evaluate further in this conversation, right? So it's always that meeting. I left there. Everything was great. I'm going to move this from 20% to 60%. And then you never hear from him again. Or it's that
Mhm.
meeting that you leave and you're like, I don't know if that guy knows how to communicate. And it turns out you're just not communicating with them the way they need to hear the information first.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. So we can have a real symbiosis because we're matching habits, and that's not always a positive, or it's positive foundationally, but there's still a warning there. I actually think, Keith, I actually think that two conceptuals talking together is like a rocket to nowhere because you're taking off
it's,
and
it's
you're
a cloud
you're
to
not going.
nowhere, man.
Yeah, yeah. And yet we also know those situations where, the energy's not there, there's not symbiosis, you are misaligned, and so that shows as well. Now, we obviously don't want that, but we are well, um, warned to learn how to, navigate out of that.
I
Would you
want to
say
add
so?
real quick because you
Yeah.
said something there that triggered a thought for me regarding the two conceptuals. This actually is probably something we've all experienced where your buyer is like, yeah, I really want you as the solution because you two have spoken the same language, but they need to speak a different language to other people in the organization and they're having a hard time selling it, right? Being able to understand the through line through the other people's potential lenses to help your buyer then be able to communicate that effectively is also because there's nothing better. Oh, I just wanted you in here, but the board said no because somebody else gave everybody else the information that they needed and you just didn't.
Mhm.
But anyway, thanks for letting me uh, ad hoc something there.
Well, I love that. In fact, so we'd love for everyone to just commiserate or just normalize the fact that we've all been there. So just type in the chat and say yes that you've been in a meeting that you thought it was amazing and you were driving and you did move whatever marker you were using in your CRM. You moved it way up the line when you got done with that, and then you got crickets. So just go ahead and type yes in the chat right now, so we don't feel bad.
So, Craig, as we were preparing and talking about this webinar, so I don't have to talk nearly as much anymore. I'm sure people are sick of hearing from me. You shared a really interesting story about a recent sales discussion. Can you share that for us? I thought it was awesome.
Yes, ironically, it's very timely, and it's ironic and sort of stunning all at the same time. But yes, we have a potential vendor that had reached out to us, and we had a first conversation, and it went pretty well. Um, but what was interesting was they asked me specifically, "Hey, if you work with us, what solution are you working on right now that you would love to get out into the market even more?" And I started to talk about listening intelligence and the different ways we see it applying. And and so I then needed to share more about what it is, because that's just, people don't quite understand it yet. And so I said, well, look, I'm a single dominant conceptual listener. So what I really need from you is to paint a picture. And it's not just about the end result. It is about, from the conversation we're having today through implementation and then execution. I need that picture. And I explained more in that moment. And I said, and I really do need to see it before we talk again. And we talked 2 weeks later, which was pretty recently, and in those 2 weeks, I didn't get anything from this person, which was interesting, even though I explained, how to sell me. Essentially said, look, this is how you win. And I handed it on a silver platter. But in that 2 weeks, I also sent him the assessment, said, love for you to know more about this. Take the assessment. And I got the results, and I was going to share it with him. He took it just the night before the next sales meeting that we had together. And so I didn't have a chance to send it to him. And so as a part of the conversation, I said to him, well, would you be surprised that you are single dominant analytical? And I explained what that meant around data and information, and then verifying it, checking for accuracy. And he absolutely resonated with it, said, without a doubt. In fact, his father was exactly like that. And I said, well, that's great. And that's been working for you. You're obviously very successful. I said, but what's ironic, right? Is I told you exactly how to sell me, and you leaned into your habit and didn't pay any attention to mine. And it's just so natural because we do that as humans, right? We act the way that comes natural to us. And so I just thought, what a case in point about why this is important. And we don't always have somebody tee up and say, I'm this kind of listener. This is how you sell me. But we probably do want to figure it out. And I think that's something we're going to talk about here in a moment. But I think it puts an exclamation point on why this is so important, especially in a sales environment.
Yeah, such a great story. I have many questions as follow up, but now's not the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, let me ask you a few more, Keith.
Okay, fire away.
Yeah. What's the best advice you give to sales teams?
The like single best is the best advice I ever got is spend all the time you can up front in discovery to understand what the client needs, what they're evaluating a solution for, and what do they need to sell it to others who may have a different habit than them. A mentor once told me, for every half hour call, spend an hour on research. I don't quite do that, but it's the point. Do all and as much discovery, understanding, and trying to seek what the emotional buying purpose is, and then try to uncover how they're going to be evaluating that decision.
So, a little bit more than, though, the traditional needs analysis and asking the same standard questions that we've been trained on for 20 plus years, is layer in the emotional buying motivator, fear, risk, and control. and understand that they're going to interpret, receive, filter information based on their listening habit. So let's do what we can to uncover that. So um, then let's be practical about it. What are the real questions that you would ask to start to decipher their listening habit?
This is actually really hard to do, is to guess someone's listening habit. I've been practicing with Echo for 4 years, and I'm probably 50%. My vice president of enterprise learning, who's been doing it for 12 years, is probably 80 to 90%, right? Like, it just takes time. But there are some very specific things you can do to suss out possibility. Number 1, at the beginning of a meeting, ask the customer how they are going to evaluate the solution. Like, what is their, not just the business criteria, what is their criteria, right? And then also ask them what they are looking for in this conversation to move to the next step. What is it that they are going to see as a success from this meeting, in order to see? Because if they come back and is like, look, I really need to know, like Craig, like you did, what's the possibility? How is this going to work? How are we going to go from today to tomorrow? And not the detail specific steps, but like paint me a picture. You probably are with someone who needs to be communicated in a conceptual way, right? I'm just going to use that as one example. And um, you're ultimately, and the point in asking this is so you can communicate them to avoid their cognitive fatigue. The more you put on them to fill in the gaps that they need, the less they're going to hear you and listen to you, and the less likely you're going to be in a position to win.
Hmm. Yep. And so staying practical then, the other question around emotional buying motivators of fear, risk, and control, what are those real questions that you would ask in a sales discussion to help you decipher those?
There are 3 questions I ask every potential prospect when we get to the point of, uh, when we get to the right point. One is, what are the risks if they don't find a solution? So if they don't find a solution, what happens? By asking this question, it's not asking about the risk emotional motivator. You are going to suss out what the risk is to them. And you might actually figure out how they're evaluating a solution, right? They might say, the risk is I lose my job. Maybe they're a reflective listener. Maybe that's something that we want to consider. I ask,
Hmm.
how are they going to measure success of the solution? So what are the measurable outcomes of a solution? In other words, how do they determine that this is and was the right fit? And then this is one I always like to ask, but don't always get an answer for, is what have been the challenges to date that have created not only the need for the solution, but have prevented them from finding a solution? So we can start sussing out both areas, what they're listening for and what their underlying emotional motivator is, by asking some negative questions, not just positive, like forward looking questions.
Yeah, I love that. And so I understand you've been around it longer than I have and others longer than you around learning listening habits. And we're sitting here saying, you've got to take this into consideration. And you're saying it takes a long time to do. And so the audience might be saying, okay, great, I'm out.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but what's that first step? And I would say it's at least learning your own, right? So Keith, like what's the value of a salesperson understanding their own listening habits?
Yeah, as I say, it's gonna take a long time. It's one of those things that once you know your own listening habits, right? And then you understand at a high level the other listening habits, you can be more agile and adaptable to the circumstance. So yeah, you might guess it wrong the first time in the first 5 minutes of a conversation, but maybe then you can frame something up in a different way to pivot. and try a reflective approach or try an analytical approach or try the conceptual approach all in the same one and see which one really draws the energy from the audience, right? Like it's like, boom, now they're really engaged. I know my dad is highly reflective. And the only way I can get him to dig into a fun story is if I ask him about him and his personal experience.
Mm,
But that aside, right? When we also know ourselves, we can understand where we need to prepare the most. So if you're at the lowest, like if you have the lowest score possible on analytical, as an example, you can get yourself prepared to go into the conversation with your prospect and put that stuff on paper. Get that stuff ready. Know that's not your natural habitual state. So that if you determine that the buyer needs that data, you can be prepared to pivot and communicate the information that they need through that conversation rather than relying on having to figure it out in the moment. So self-awareness is the a big element to creating that agility and adaptability.
right. So, if I were to answer that question based on what I've learned recently, I think there's a couple things to watch out for. And learning my own listening habit helps me to watch out for it in sales conversations. One, if I'm engaged with a connective listener on the other side of the conversation, um, they're gonna likely trick me whether they know it or not. They're not really intending to, but a connective listener is going to try to connect with me. They're going to look outgoing. They're going to look like they're fully engaged. They're going to be the one where you leave and say, they were buying everything I was saying. Maybe. Also, maybe
Maybe.
not.
That's right.
And so just let's not get fooled by that connective listener. So understanding there are connective listeners out there, let's make sure we're not assuming we got to yes any sooner than we really did.
Mm,
Second, just to put a fine point on it, the corporate slang, not slang, but the corporate jargon of data-driven decisions. No one's going to argue with that, right? Like we need to make data-driven decisions. However, not everyone is an analytical listener. So they might be saying, I want a data driven decision, but they're listening very different. You said this earlier, but I'm just putting that point on it is we need to pay attention to listening habits so that we are more agile, more adept in that sales conversation. So those would be my
mhm.
answers to that same question.
And before we get a yes, be like too premature. I forget how you framed it, but that was I think every salesperson on the world has ever felt that, oh, I've got this in the bag, and then never heard from him again, right?
Well, certainly others have said it to me, and I say it to my team, take yes for an answer, right?
Yeah.
When you get to yes, sort of stop talking. There have been sales trainers that say that very thing. When somebody says yes, stop talking.
Yeah.
Well, the connective listener is going to probably trick you into thinking they're saying yes, and you're going to
Right.
think you've got it, and you're still a long way
Yep.
away. They're just a
Yeah.
really nice person with a connective listening habit.
That's right.
Yeah. So here are some questions that we've gotten. Keith, to you, what do you do with motivators and listening habits when it's a group discussion?
Yeah. In preparation for whatever you're going to be presenting, we instruct every group in this way. Speak to the data first. You've got 10 people in a room. You're not going to be able to suss out whose listening habits what and who's where. So speak to the analytical listeners first. You are going to lose them the fastest if you start with a story or if you start with an analogy or if you start with the big picture. They just will more than likely, not guaranteed, right? Just more than likely check out. And you don't want to lose them because they're the ones that are going to be critical to making whatever happens happen. Um, then speak to those who have a reflective listening habit because you're going to lose them next. Like if they can't figure out what this has to do with them or figure out how it's been done before, quickly, you will lose them through the rest of the conversation more than likely, right? Not a guarantee, but I got to couch it. Then speak to the conceptual or connective. Like there's no real, you know, they give you more grace as a listening habit, especially your connective listeners, probably going to give you a lot more grace, but there's really no data to support speaking to either one of them, third or fourth. So, whatever you're most comfortable with. So, prepare your presentation with that flow to maximize the attention of the audience.
Mm, okay, that's great. Is somebody's listening type, is it static or does it change over time?
I love this question. I just got it today. Um, it can change over time and it can change based on context. Keep in mind it's a habit at the end of the day. So we can change our habits if we choose to. But changing a habit, the data is about it takes about 9 months to change a truly ingrained habit. So it takes time to change those habits. But if you put intention behind it, we're not going to see a reduction of your dominant habits. We're going to see an increase of those other habits that took more energy previously. You've just trained them to require less energy. And I'll use an analogy here. If you're born in the United States, you learn to drive on the right side of the road, left side of the car. If you move to some European countries and you learn to drive on the left side of the road, right side of the car, it's a hard lift to make that change. But once you do, you come home, you can drive as you used to. You might have to adjust a little bit, but that it doesn't just go away, that ability, right? So that's how we see those habits change. And the last piece I'll add to that is it can change based on the context of your job. We see it all the time. People with highly analytical habits in a individual contributor role suddenly go up to a director role, and they've trained their connective habit to really see information through the lens of the impact on the team versus the specifics and the details. Um, so they are not ingrained, and they are not permanent, and they are not who you are.
In thinking about a sales environment and trying to suss out what somebody's listening habit is, your prospect, talk about how you can do that when you are in the middle of communicating with them.
Mm. The best way I've found, and that we often say, is it's based on the questions that they ask, right? Um, I'd love to say it's body language. Each habit has a tendency, but it's not guaranteed, right? So that lowers the possibility of guessing. But the questions that they ask, what information are they asking for? Don't be afraid of it. When they ask that question, answer what they're looking for because they are likely trying to satisfy some tension that they've had through the state of the interaction. And if you avoid the conversation, you aren't satisfying the information that they need. You can lose them even further, and it's just going to be harder to get them to sink their teeth into the evaluation of whatever solution you're presenting.
So that's the idea that we tend to speak like we listen. And so when
Hmm.
they're asking the question, that's them speaking. They're asking a question which you have to answer, but in another sense, they're actually giving you information based
They
on
are.
the information they're asking for. And so
Love
we
that.
use that as a clue. Yeah.
Love that. Love that frame. Yeah.
Well, Keith, I really want to just thank you for joining us here today. I appreciate your knowledge and experience, and that's why I call on you with questions all the time around listening intelligence specifically. Really thrilled that you joined us here today. And so just want to share with everyone that's listening that we are here to talk with you about this topic at any point. And so please reach out. We would love for you to learn your own listening habit and see how it applies for you personally and how it can apply for you in your current business role, whether it is sales or another. There are plenty of other contexts where this is incredibly useful, and we're going to be sharing more about that in upcoming events. So, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me too, Craig. I really, really appreciate you bringing me here.